Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, China and the United States have agreed to remove most tariffs following high-level talks in Switzerland. A ceasefire between India and Pakistan is underway, though the two countries have accused each other of violations. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says his country is ready to resume direct talks with Russia if Moscow agrees to a Kyiv-proposed ceasefire. We start with the China-US trade talks in Switzerland. Beijing and Washington have agreed to remove most of the tariffs on each other's goods following high-level talks in Geneva. According to a joint statement, the two sides will remove 91% of tariffs and suspend 24% for a period of 90 days, while further talks continue. After the adjustment, both sides will retain a 10% baseline tariff, while a 20% fentanyl-linked levy the US imposed earlier this year will remain. The two sides will establish a framework to continue discussions about economic and trade relations. A Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson says the joint statement is an important step toward resolving differences between the two countries through equal dialogue and consultation. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng says the two-day talks with the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer have seen substantial progress. Ken Brown has more from the Swiss city.
Well, after 2 days of high-level economic and trade talks, the Chinese delegation held a press conference at the China Mission to the World Trade Building. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng stated that both sides engaged in thorough discussions on economic and trade issues of mutual concern. The talks were described as candid, thorough and constructive, with substantial progress made and specific consensus reached. Here's a little bit more of what he said.
The two sides agreed on establishing a consultation mechanism for trade and economic issues, identify the lead persons on each side, and will carry on further consultations related to trade and economic issues of their respective concerns.
We also heard U.S. lead Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He talked up the positive nature of these talks too. Both thanked their Swiss hosts here in Geneva for providing the platform for these exchanges. Here's a bit more from what the U.S. Treasury Secretary said.
I can tell you that the talks were productive. We had the Vice Premier, two Vice Ministers who were integrally involved, Ambassador Jameson and myself, and I spoke to President Trump, as did Ambassador Jameson, and he is fully informed of what is going on.
This was, as the Secretary pointed out, a very constructive 2 days. It's important to understand how quickly we were able to come to agreement, which reflects that perhaps the differences were not so large as maybe thought.
So both sides characterizing these as positive talks.
That was Ken Brown in Geneva. In Asia, a ceasefire between India and Pakistan is underway, though the two countries have accused each other of violations. People displaced by the conflict have begun returning to their homes. Over 60 people from both countries have died over the past days after India launched attacks inside Pakistan. India has blamed Pakistan for an attack that killed 26 tourists in Indian-controlled Kashmir. Pakistan has denied any involvement. Anis Zaga spoke to some locals on the ceasefire.
Residents in the Indian-administered Kashmir heaved a sigh of relief after India and Pakistan announced ceasefire after days of cross-border hostilities. Locals are returning to normal lives after tensions ran high for more than 2 weeks. Markets and shops are reopening without the fear of any further escalation.
Here in Kashmir, the atmosphere has been tense and business had to come to a standstill, so there's hope now that things will get better. The ceasefire that was announced yesterday. If we look at the build-up over the past week, starting with what happened in Pahalgam and then the escalation between the two countries, we must keep in mind that these are nuclear powers.
In past week, over a dozen civilians, including children, lost their lives in the firing along the border between India and Pakistan. While both the countries were locked in a severe conflict, residents mostly stayed indoors fearing the escalating violence.
We Kashmiris have always longed for peace. We have never wanted violence, nor will we ever want it. But the peace we seek should not be the peace of a graveyard. We want peace in the real sense and spirit.
The ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan has not just brought relief to the people living along the line of control and the international border, but also to the residents of Jammu and Kashmir. Even if there is uncertainty about how long this peace agreement would last, but people believe that this might mark the beginning of something that will last for a longer period of time.
That was Anis Zaga in Srinagar. In Europe, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says his country is ready to resume direct talks with Russia if it agrees to a Kyiv-proposed ceasefire. Russian President Vladimir Putin has proposed holding direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul on Thursday. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has confirmed his country's readiness to host the peace negotiations between the two countries. Mihail Banovic has more.
Late Saturday, Russian President Vladimir Putin made the proposal. He suggested that Moscow and Kiev should hold direct peace talks in Istanbul on Thursday. Following some hesitation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has agreed to the meeting, but stated that he expects Moscow to implement a ceasefire starting Monday. On social media platform X, Zelenskyy said a ceasefire would provide the necessary basis for diplomacy and that he would personally be waiting for Putin in Turkey. Western leaders who are part of the so-called coalition of the willing had met with Zelenskyy in Kiev on Saturday and demanded Putin agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire or face massive new sanctions. Though the EU had the support of the U.S. in its threat of sanctions, it was U.S. President Donald Trump that appeared to make the biggest push for talks. In a post on Truth Social, Trump told Zelenskyy that he should agree to meet Putin immediately. Have the meeting now, Trump wrote. Shortly afterwards, Zelenskyy confirmed his participation. If held as planned, the talks will coincide with the second day of an informal NATO foreign ministers meeting also taking place in Turkey, though in the city of Antalya. On Sunday, President Putin spoke by phone with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, with Ankara confirming it is ready to host the talks in Istanbul.
That was Mihail Banovic reporting. Staying in Europe, exit polls in Albania show that the ruling Socialist Party is leading in the country's parliamentary elections. First results are expected on Tuesday. This is Albania's first parliamentary election since it formally opened accession talks with the European Union in July 2022. Evangelos Sipsis has more from Tirana.
Well, right. What we do know right now is that just over 40% of those 3.7 million people have voted, and what it seems like Edi Rama will be the country's next prime minister. That's what the exit polls show at this given moment. He has gathered more than 50% of those votes, and from what it seems like, it would be his fourth term into leading this country. Again, it is the first time that overseas Albanians are allowed to vote. More than 250,000 of them living across the globe were eligible to go and vote, and that vote is quite significant because the population of people who are voting here in Albania are 3.7, so that 250,000 could make a significant dent, let's just say, in this outcome. Now, if we go a little bit to see how the day went and how people turned out, it was quite steady, especially in the large metropolitan areas like Tirana, Skondre, and Durrës. There was heavy police presence, and you could see them scattered actually all across the country, especially here in the capital of Tirana. Just a reminder here that in past elections there has been some issues. There were some violence, there were some problems that were taking place, and that's why this time around we saw that heavy presence. Now it seems like the polls are, the votes are still being counted, but as things stand right now, Edi Rama's Socialist Party will lead the country once again. Number one on Edi Rama's agenda was being part of the European Union. Even actually one of his main posters showed a hand with 5 fingers, which indicates that the country will be part of the European Union in the next 5 years by 2030. And he really pushed hard for that. And that was the hope that a lot of people that went to vote for his party. But I have to remind here that he also faced a lot of outrage from the public because of allegations, corruption allegations of some of his top officials that faced with this multi-million euro waste management scandal. And people here do feel divided because of that. Now, on the other side, Berisha, who was the person who was trying to bring this comeback actually here in Albania, a person who was a previous prime minister. He also was on the list as well of corruption scandals. That's why he was banned from the US and the UK. So from what it seems like, the people went out to vote here. One, better justice system, less corruption. They want those promises to be fulfilled, what Edi Rama has been saying. And the European Union membership is quite high on the agenda. So whoever's going to lead this country in the next 4 years, the number one problem here is justice, corruption, but also being part of the European Union.
That was Evangelos Sipsis reporting from Tirana. Turning to the Middle East, Hamas says it's engaged in direct talks with the United States on a ceasefire and the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Washington's envoy to Israel says a US-backed system for getting aid into Gaza should take effect soon. Israel cut off all supplies to the 2.3 million residents of Gaza in early March. It ended the January ceasefire agreement with Hamas on March 18th and renewed its military campaign. Israel says it plans to further expand in Gaza. Amid talks with Hamas, US President Donald Trump will travel to the Middle East, the first major overseas trip of his second term. The White House says the trip will focus on trade and investment. Jim Spellman has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump will depart Washington on Monday and spend much of the coming week in the Middle East.
The president looks forward to embarking on his historic return to the Middle East, visiting Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates next week, where he will focus on strengthening ties between our nations.
Key issues on the agenda include negotiations with Iran over a new nuclear deal and the conflict in Gaza, but the White House says trade and business are the top priorities for the trip. Trump is scheduled to attend a U.S.-Saudi business conference in Riyadh and is expected to highlight commitments by Saudi Arabia to invest at least $600 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years, and the UAE's pledge to invest $1.4 trillion over the next decade. Critics worry Trump will use the trip to advance his family's business interests in the region. The White House declined to say if any family members will travel with the president, but denied Trump will use the trip for personal financial gain. Trump is also expected to visit U.S. troops stationed in Qatar and has suggested he may use the trip to announce the U.S. will begin referring to the Persian Gulf as the Gulf of Arabia, a possibility that has created fierce backlash in Iran.
That was Jim Spellman reporting. Finally, in Africa, over 1 million displaced people in Uganda are facing severe food shortages. The World Food Programme has slashed rations due to funding challenges, pushing malnutrition rates higher and raising fears of a humanitarian crisis. Michael Baliki has more from Kampala.
Bidi, once a quiet village in northern Uganda, now shelters more than 270,000 refugees, most fleeing conflict and hunger in South Sudan. But today, many here face a new crisis. Food rations have been cut and families are left with barely enough to survive.
We used to get 4 kilograms of posho and half a liter of cooking oil, barely enough for a month. Now even that's gone. What do we do next? How do we survive?
Susan Dusman, a mother of 3, is one of over 1 million refugees now cut off from food aid. The World Food Programme says it needs at least $50 million to restart support initiatives in Uganda.
That makes children more vulnerable, and the cases that we are recording right now on the rise are the child malnutrition, mostly, at this time. Though adults are also there, but the children are more affected.
Aid agencies warn that global donor fatigue is leaving countries like Uganda behind as international attention shifts to newer crises.
Uganda has kept its borders open, offering land and public services to refugees. But with donor funding drying up, officials say the country cannot carry the burden alone.
More than 60,000 new refugees have arrived in just 3 months, increasing the pressure on already stretched health services and schools.
It's fueling crime. In other words, some refugees are now are forced to go and steal from the neighbors and so on, then violence erupts. But I think that one is a difficult process because we are trying to make the refugee become resilient, to get them jobs. Even the kind of training, we try to make some short-term courses whereby they learn some skills so that they can earn from their own work.
Uganda's refugee policy has long been praised as one of the most generous in the world. But with no end in sight to conflicts in South Sudan or DR Congo, the challenge now is not just feeding 1 million people today, but preventing an even larger crisis tomorrow.
That is Michael Baliki in Kampala. Now, recapping the headlines before we go, China and the United States have agreed to remove most tariffs following high-level talks in Switzerland. A ceasefire between India and Pakistan is underway, though the two countries have accused each other of violations. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says his country is ready to resume direct talks with Russia if Moscow agrees to a Kyiv-proposed ceasefire. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We would welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Chiju. Thank you for listening.